Hi there, my name is Kresten. For the last 10 years I've been part of the group that is putting together the program for the JAOO conferences. And having done that for some years, I've noticed that many of the interesting discussions actually take place in the hallway, or they take place at least somewhere outside of the official sessions. And so this very concept is what we're trying to capture here in this series of small clips, and put together some speakers to have this kind of more informal discussion about things that they've spoken about sessions and what other people think about that from in between the real sessions of the conference. Please enjoy. So here's a clip with Glenn Vanderburg, Chad Fowler, and Marcel Molina. Glenn was track host of the Ruby track this year. Chad was actually giving a talk on active record stuff. And Marcel was giving a presentation on beautiful code. And the discussions that we're going into here are about Marcel's presentation on beautiful code. What does it mean for code to be beautiful? How does that relate to software patterns? And what does beautiful code really mean for the quality of the software that we're creating? So hope you'll enjoy the discussion here. So we're here with some of the speakers at JAOO, talking about what's happening, what are some of the interesting trends coming on, and I'd like maybe if you could just introduce yourself. Glenn?
I'm Glenn Vanderburg. I'm a consultant. I work for Relevance, which is a US-based consulting company, and we're focused right now on Ruby and development in Ruby and agile practices. And I chaired the Ruby track here at JAOO this year.
I'm Marcel Molina. I'm involved in the Ruby community for a while now. Mostly been working with the Rails project, and that's it.
I'm Chad Fowler, and I'm with InfoEther Incorporated. We do Ruby and Rails consulting as well as product development. And I'm also with Ruby Central Incorporated and co-organizer of RubyConf and RailsConf.
So we wanted to, you had some ideas for what we should talk about.
Well, when I was choosing speakers for the Ruby track, I invited Marcel, and it was really non-specific. Marcel, I'd love for you to come speak and think about what topic you want to talk about. And Marcel came up with this idea for a talk about what makes code beautiful. And I loved that idea, and it turned out to be a great talk. But what I wasn't expecting and what's come out of that is that idea has kept cropping up, and even started before Marcel's talk with Bob Martin's Monday morning keynote. And I just left a talk by Kevlin Henney, and he was talking about the same idea yet again. And it seems to be an undercurrent here at JAOO this year. And a couple of months ago, O'Reilly published a giant book titled Beautiful Code. So that seems to be a topic that people are starting to take interest in. And it's interesting to me to talk about why that is, and whether that's just programmers kind of worrying about something that's egotistical and useless, or whether that has practical value for projects and for our industry.
Yeah, it's one thing I was concerned about and sort of paranoid about was, in talking about beautiful code, I think a lot of people in the industry would think that it wasn't important, and that it was sort of an indulgence, and that it wasn't really helpful. But what I was discovering through reading about it and considering the stuff that I was doing in terms of beauty was that beauty was really an indicator of quality, and that when I achieved stuff that I felt was beautiful, it also happened to coincide with the best software that I'd written. And then I would think about what I'd read about how to write great software, some of Kent Beck's books like Smalltalk's Best Practice Patterns, and trying to look at all the patterns, all the directions that those patterns are moving you towards ended up being the same directions that the definitions of beauty move you towards. And there was starting to be this, basically a parallel between beautiful code and high quality code. And that seemed like a really important point to bring up, because you're not doing this just because you want to be an artist.
Right.
You're doing this because it happens to create the best software that you can write.
And because you want to be an artist.
And because you want to be an artist.
So it's important to point out the fact that when you talk about definitions of beauty, you are in fact talking about classical definitions of beauty. And so this sort of beauty applies to functional objects really well, just by chance, as opposed to, you know, the common thing when we start talking about this is people will say, well, what about Picasso or other more abstract things? How does that apply to software development? And it probably, at least in the context of how you framed it, it doesn't. But it might be worthwhile just laying out what the classical definitions are really quickly, so that...
Yeah, so I read some books to try to figure out what classical definitions were of beauty, and I started with classical definitions because classical definitions are usually very simple and small and not really sophisticated and rigorous and 5,000 page long academic things. And I arrived at 3 rules that Thomas Aquinas had, which were in part borrowed from Plato and Pythagoras and really old thinking like that. But St. Thomas Aquinas had these 3 principles. One is proportionality, and for something to be beautiful it has to be proportional, and a good metaphor for that is looking at my hand and the size of my fingers, the size of my palm relative to my fingers and my forearm and all those kinds of things, and the size of them and the relationship between them all contribute to how they function. And if they were longer or shorter, they wouldn't function as well, and so they wouldn't be as beautiful because of their structure being incorrect. The second is integrity, which has to do with the degree to which something can achieve what it's intended to achieve.
Fitness for purpose.
Fitness for purpose.
Yeah.
So if you had a hammer that was made out of crystal, it would be potentially a beautiful object, but it would be a terrible hammer because you would try to hit a nail and the hammer would shatter. And the third is clarity, which for Aquinas had religious connotations that had to do with God, but you can translate that in terms of software to simplicity and clarity of code, how clear versus how obfuscated and complicated the code is. And so those are the 3 principles: integrity, proportionality, and clarity. And not only are they in isolation metrics that you can use to evaluate the work that you're doing, but they all work together to be a form of checks and balances. So if you can reach great proportionality by doing something expressively and succinctly, but if you lose clarity, you've ultimately not satisfied those 3 guiding principles towards beauty. So that was the classical definition that I've been working off of initially, just to say, how can we look at software and actually run it through these filters and evaluate the degree to which it's satisfying this classical definition of what makes something beautiful. And I think the interesting thing about this definition of beauty is that most people have a very ephemeral notion of what beauty is. If you said to them, what's beautiful, they would think of beautiful objects, which doesn't really tell you what beauty is, it just gives you examples of beauty. Right. But you don't know the underlying reasons for why that's beautiful. Right. And so I think it's useful to have very structural reasons for what makes something beautiful, and recognize that it's not just this aesthetic experience, that aesthetic experience is brought from a deeper structure.
Yeah. So actually it's kind of interesting, because I've always, or for many years I've thought that Christopher Alexander and all his patterns talk, right? I went to Uppsala in '96 where I gave his keynote, and one of the things that has been striking coming out of there is this very important principle of his patterns, which is quality within.
Yes, quality without a name.
Right.
Right.
The quality without a name. Yes.
Yes.
And so there's a very important aspect of pretty much what you call beauty, right, in Christopher Alexander's writing, and that's something that's been totally forgotten. So patterns community is just more or less, I mean, I get slammed for this, but more or less kind of just these tips and tricks that are kind of random, right? You know, sometimes people collect them in nice pattern languages or collections of patterns that kind of fit together, but other than that, it's just kind of repeat experience, and often you don't see this quality. Right. Or beauty being part of a pattern. Right?
What's interesting about that is that Alexander is coming from the community architecture, physical architecture, not what we do, but physical architecture, where you know, there was a strong there has been and is a strong tendency for architects to kind of want to be artists, contrary to what we were saying about software developers. And Alexander was really trying to drag that back toward the real world and emphasize fitness for purpose. And fitness for purpose tends to be the one of those three that programmers don't forget. And I think we need, you know, at the end of the day, it has to work, it has to function and do the right thing. And we need to emphasize, on the other hand, proportionality and clarity. And
so I think it's very interesting that this now it's starting to be a trend again. It's very nice because it's kind of been missing in this.
I think an interesting difference between Christopher Alexander's pattern language and patterns in software is that with pattern language, broken up through all of its sections and all of the little patterns that he shows you, he's basically saying, combining all these patterns together, you can define the perfect city. And if it has a certain number of parks and they're distributed a certain way, X, Y, and Z, you get this very holistic view of a perfect city. Whereas in software, on the micro level, it has the same approach with the patterns, but it's usually, here's an isolated pattern for this specific problem. Sometimes it's used in combinations with these other things, but it's basically a bunch of recipes rather than a holistic approach at the perfect thing. So it seems like I mean, this isn't necessarily related to beauty directly, though I think obliquely it is. It's interesting to think of it in terms of the holistic approach that Alexander is taking, saying, this is how you write the perfect piece of software by combining all of these pieces and identifying what all the pieces are, which is really different from the way that I think patterns are used in software.
We have marginally few years of experience in our profession versus
Yeah, I think
so it may be that at some point someone can come up with the equivalent of what you
right.
did.
I mean, we're still babes in the woods in our industry.
So another interesting thing to point out, though, back to the beauty thing that you were bringing up, is what Marcel has laid out, this proportionality, integrity, clarity, is one way to not even find beauty, but to detect ugliness, really. That's what Glenn has been calling it.
It's not a beauty generator, but it's an ugliness detector, those three principles.
Right, but if you look at all of the patterns of the software community, for example, Kent Beck's book that Marcel referenced, the Smalltalk Best Practice Patterns, many of the patterns in that are about tweaking and balancing these three things. If you can look at them and find that they are. And the same is true of Martin Fowler's refactorings. Go through the refactoring book, look at the code smells, chapter 3, and you'll find that a lot of the code smells are because of violations of one or more of these three elements.
And I think we're interested in them, not out of some abstract love of beauty, but as engineers, we realize that that has practical value. The software is so complicated, you have to find ways of understanding it and looking at it and zeroing in on the problems or knowing where to accept the good things. And notions of beauty can be real useful drivers of that. When I teach test-driven development, I teach refactoring. And one of the questions I talk to people about is this just aesthetics? Is it just making code pretty? And the answer I have is no, it's not. It has real practical value and it keeps the code easy to understand and easy to work with and malleable. But when I'm doing it, I don't think about that. I'm driven by aesthetics. I want to make the code pretty. And that's thinking about long-term concerns and trying to imagine all the things people might want to do with this is going to get me confused, and I'll think about things that turn out to be irrelevant later. But being driven by what makes the code beautiful ends up producing the right effect.
Yeah, so this kind of ties into then before we started the tech, we also discussed how this fits into the more general trend. This beautiful code, how that fits into the more general trend of kind of craftsmanship,
right?
Which is current and is definitely happening. Also part of as a trend coming right now. Right?
Yes, and so Bob Martin's keynote Monday morning was all about, or at least partly about that, and about personal responsibility of us as software engineers, taking control of what we do and having professional standards, and trying to do it with good craftsmanship. And that word craft has some negative connotations that I don't think describe what software people do. But craftsmanship, I think, has a lot of applicability.
Yeah. If I think of craftsmanship, I can just imagine for talking purposes 2 different sides that you can fall on if you're someone building an object, say a cabinet. You could be really concerned with it being functionally appropriate and being a very good cabinet. And you can also be concerned with it being a beautiful object, like a work of art. And in thinking about cabinets in general, I can't think of an example where you had a very functional cabinet that was very ugly, right? I think in physical objects, the desirability of an object is very much connected with both how useful it is and also how attractive it is. And the most unattractive cabinets also happen to usually be made of cheap materials, and so they fall apart, and so they actually aren't as functional as they might seem, just fully utilitarian. So, if I relate this back to software, I imagined that in bringing up beauty, there would be people who say, I only care about correctness, and I don't care how attractive it is. But moving that over to the physical world and thinking about a craftsman building something, usually the best examples of those objects are both totally appropriate to their function, but also beautiful in and of themselves as objects. And I think those 2 things are actually intimately related, not orthogonal concerns.
I think that's especially true if you separate pretty from, that's an important thing to do. Because it might be that, to use the example of a cabinet, there is a cabinet that was made in the 1970s that still exists because it was so well made. And people thought of it as beautiful at the time, but our sensibilities now aren't in line with what they were in the 70s, and therefore it seems ugly in terms of just that prettiness thing, Well,
Marcel's talk, you spoke about how beauty is often contextual and related to circumstance and the needs of the moment. And in some cases, there's an engineering artifact that I think by most standards looked at in the abstract, it's hideously ugly. I'm talking about the MIME email protocol. In the abstract, there's nothing beautiful about that. But I'm old enough to remember the circumstances in which it was designed and the broken mail transfer systems around and conflicting standards, and they had to design something that would work in all of those crazy situations that for the most part have gone away now. And the constraints on that protocol were amazingly horrible. And they built something that works, and every mail system that anybody uses today understands it and can generate it, and there's beauty in that. Some of the details aren't beautiful, but as an engineering artifact, in that case, the circumstances and the constraints and the need to have something that had integrity and somebody's described it as sort of the 4-wheel drive of protocols, and there's beauty in that situation when that's what you need.
Yeah, but there's also, it seems that users and customers or whatever who's driving requirements from the outside, right, are starting to be more aware of beauty and quality of these kinds of things, right?
I think the perfect example of that is the rise right now of Apple and OS X. And because I think people are finding it beautiful. That's I think the first response. You'll see the commercials. It'll just show an object. That's a funny thing. Like the new commercials for iMacs, is that what they're called?
Yes.
It just has the iMac doing a 360.
And that's it.
Like a model at the end of a runway doing the 360, and it's just saying, look at this beautiful object. That's it. We're not going to tell you any of the details. We're not going to tell you how much RAM. We're not going to tell you what the price is.
Even the operating system.
Yeah.
You don't know what happens when you turn it on.
Well, and so there's what makes that work is an inference people draw.
Right, it's the entry point.
So somebody who cares that much about the physical appearance is also going to care about the other aspects.
Right, but I think it's about judging a book by its cover, which I totally do. And it's actually really effective in books.
Does, right.
I judge books by their covers, and it has something to do with who the publisher is and which publishers will have which writers and vice versa. And I can't actually think of a book that I really love that has a terrible cover, and vice versa.
I can think of one.
One. But no, I think with OS X and with the Mac, people see this beautiful object, and that's the hook. that makes them interested, but once they actually use it, it's very stable, it's very functional, and it's very intuitive and all those kinds of things, and it's all related.
But we're both talking about rules of thumb and heuristics. And this, judging a book by its cover, looking at the iMac and saying, wow, a company that takes that much care in the physical appearance is also going to care about how it works and making it easy to use and everything else. Is it foolproof? No. But, and is it foolproof that thinking about beauty in code is going to yield a better design? Well, probably not. But at the same time, it works an awful lot of the time, and it's a really good heuristic. And when we're trying to make decisions and build software in a reasonable time scale, and try to spend our time worrying about the really important decisions and not about things that ultimately are less important, it's a really good heuristic.
Right, right. But it's easy to talk about Apple or some other product, right? Like this chair or this table, which are really nice, right? But they're products,
right?
So how do we transform this notion of beauty into these situations where we're building a piece of software for a client, or have a team, they're doing this piece of software probably only for one customer, right? How do you make beauty in that? How do you transform beauty into that?
Well, are you talking about, there's also a difference between the actual source code, which the customer might not look at.
Well, just in general, that in that setting, there isn't the same kind of leverage.
We have to admit that notions of beauty in code are sort of artificial. That it's, unless you know programming, and in fact, unless you are experienced at programming, I don't think you're going to have a well-formed notion of what beautiful code is. So where does that come from? It comes from our experience, and it's a way our minds distill our experience about what works and what doesn't, and what's good and what isn't. And I think part of the reason that customers and users are starting to take us seriously when we talk about this is that at least my customers are finally starting to understand the trade-off between cost of creation and cost of ownership over the long term, and understanding that when we want a little more time to build a beautiful design, that might pay off and is likely to pay off in real dollars over the whole life cycle of a system.
Right, but to his point, if you or your team are the only people who can evaluate and appreciate the beauty of the code itself, it's not directly being exposed to the customer for whom all of this work is being done in part. But I would claim that so Ruby, one of the big motivations for Ruby that Matz, the creator of Ruby, presents is to optimize programmer joy. And at the time I discovered Ruby, I was evaluating all these languages and learning all this stuff about programming. And when I arrived at someone creating a language who said, I'm really interested in basically going through a lot of work to make programmers happy, as someone who is shopping around for a programming language, it's a very attractive pitch. Someone wants to make me happy. And I found that when I was starting to use Ruby, I would have these strange moments of joy where I was just enjoying myself. And I think when you're taking pride in the work that you're doing, in the craft of your work, and you're creating something beautiful that's functional, that drives you over the long haul so much better than fighting every day against the motivation of, I don't want to get out of bed, this project's doomed, et cetera, et cetera. And since projects happen over long spans of time, even if your clients aren't checking your commits every day and seeing what you're doing, the fact that driving and striving for beauty is giving you the momentum to create great software ends up being a huge benefit to them.
Right. Programmers that are striving for beauty as you're defining it, not just prettiness, but beauty, end up probably creating better stuff. Programmers that are striving to make pretty things or elegant things without a framework for what that means can end up doing, code golf in their code. And so you can take these concepts of beauty and pull them out of the code and to the delivery, and they still make sense. The proportionality of the thing you've created, and even the time you spend doing features for your customer, and the integrity of it, and the clarity of what you're delivering to them, are all also good measures at one step higher than just the design of your code. It could be applied to your project, it could be applied to the actual delivered stuff, the interfaces, everything else.
At the level of the code, the customers might not see, probably won't see, might not understand not having the experience, might not be equipped to understand what we think of as code beauty. It's a tool for us, both a practical tool and a psychological tool for us to do better work, and that benefits the customers, so that's good.
Although it occurs to me, a lot of the holy grail of software right now that I see, and the stuff that Simeone is doing with intentional software, and the stuff that testing people are doing with really high-level user stories, is to be able to write code that's so clear and so expressive that the domain experts and the business people can come in and look at your code and read it and understand it, and even one day write some of it. Write your use cases, your stories, etc., maybe even modify your code. And I'm finding that as someone who studied literature and someone who's interested in this beauty stuff because of the sort of expressive nature that it affords you, even though we're talking about the customers and clients never actually looking at the code and being able to appreciate it on that level, it might get to a point where, and I think it's getting pretty close now, code is so simple and expressive that it really is to look at it and go, that totally mortgaging system works. I'm blown away. And that's understandable. And someone, I mean, I don't want to sound dramatic, but it gives me shivers thinking about that. To be able to encapsulate that kind of complexity into something that's so simple and clear. Because I think that's, literature, any kind of art, all those things are about taking things in the real world that are immediately evident and aren't immediate, and creating a mechanism for people to understand them.